The lighthouse beams swept across the churning gray waters as Kieran Thorne climbed the spiral stairs for the third time that evening. The storm had been building since dawn, and now the wind howled like a living thing, rattling the ancient stone walls of Beacon's Point. He'd tended this lighthouse for 7 years. Through countless storms, had learned to read the sea's moods like an old book, but tonight felt different. The waves crashed against the rocky shore below with unusual violence, sending spray high enough to streak the lighthouse windows with salt. Kieran adjusted the great lens, ensuring the beacon would continue its steady rotation through the night. Ships would need every bit of guidance they could get in this tempest. He was about to descend when movement caught his eye something dark, tumbling in the white foam of a massive wave. At first he thought it might be driftwood, but then he saw an arm thrust up from the water, grasping desperately at nothing. "Damn," he muttered, already moving toward the narrow stairs that led down to the rocky beach. The wind nearly knocked him sideways as he emerged from the lighthouse's shelter, and the rain stung his face like needles. He grabbed the coil of rope he kept by the door and ran toward the shoreline. The waves had carried the figure closer to the rock's dangerous territory where many ships had met their end. Kieran could see now that it was a woman, her dark hair streaming behind her like seaweed, her waterlogged clothes weighing her down as she fought to stay above the surface. "Here," he shouted, though he doubted she could hear him over the storm's roar. He secured one end of the rope around a sturdy piece of driftwood wedged between two boulders and waded into the freezing surf. The current was stronger than he'd expected, pulling at his legs as he worked his way closer to where she struggled. A wave knocked him sideways, filling his mouth with bitter seawater, but he kept going. When he was close enough, he threw the ropes free and toward her. She caught it on the second try, her fingers barely able to maintain their grip on the wet hemp. Kieran pulled steadily, fighting both the waves and her dead weight as consciousness seemed to fade in and out. Finally, he managed to drag her onto the rocky beach, both of them gasping and shivering. She was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 25, with olive skin and sharp features that spoke of distant lands. Her clothes were strange, a rap-style tunic and loose trousers made from fabric he didn't recognize, now torn and stained with salt water. Most peculiar were the intricate blue tattoos that spiraled around her wrists and disappeared beneath her sleeves. "Can you hear me?" he asked, leaning close to her face. Her eyes fluttered open, an unusual amber color that seemed to catch the lighthouse beam even in her weakened state. She tried to speak but only managed a harsh cough that brought up seawater. Kieran didn't hesitate. He scooped her up in his arms, surprised by how light she felt despite her waterlogged clothing, and carried her toward the lighthouse. The climb up the winding path had never seemed so long, with the wind trying to push them both over the cliff's edge. Inside, he laid her on the simple cot in the corner of his living quarters and quickly stoked the fire in the small hearth. She was unconscious again, her breathing shallow and rapid. He'd seen enough storm victims to know the signs of exposure. She needed warmth and dry clothes immediately, working efficiently. He peeled away her wet garments and wrapped her in his warmest blanket, trying not to notice the way the firelight played across her skin or the graceful curve of her neck. There would be time for such observations later. She survived the night. As he hung her clothes to dry, he noticed something odd sewn into the lining of her tunic. Small shells and what looked like carved bone arranged in a pattern that meant nothing to him. Whatever land she came from, it was far from here. The woman stirred as warmth began to return to her body, murmuring words in a language he'd never heard before. Kieran settled into his chair beside the fire, keeping watch over his unexpected guest as the storm continued its assault on Beacon's Point. Tomorrow, he would have questions. Tonight, he simply hoped she would live to answer them. The woman woke at dawn, when the storm had finally exhausted itself and left only the gentle lapping of waves against the rocks below. Kieran had dozed fitfully in his chair, starting awake every time she stirred or murmured in her sleep. Her amber eyes were fully open, alert and wary as they took in her surroundings. "You're safe," he said quietly, not moving from his chair. He'd learned that sudden movements often frightened people who'd been through trauma. The storm brought, "You too sure?" "I'm Kieran." She sat up slowly, pulling the blanket closer around herself. When she spoke, her accent was thick, but her words were carefully chosen. I am... Naya. She paused, as if testing how the name sounded in this new place. You pulled me from the water. The rope did most of the work. Kieran gestured toward. Her clothes now dry and folded on the small table. I'll turn around while you dress. Then we should get some food into you. She nodded once, a formal gesture that seemed more like a bow than simple agreement. As he faced the window, he could hear the rustle of fabric and her sharp intake of breath, probably from muscles stiff with cold and salt water. Where am I? She asked when she was dressed. Beacon's Point. About 20 miles north of Saltmere Village. He turned back to find her examining the lighthouse's interior with keen interest, her gaze lingering on his navigation charts and weather instruments. Where were you trying to get to? Something shifted in her expression, walls going up behind her eyes. Away, she said simply. Just ... away. Kieran had spent enough years in solitude to recognize someone who didn't want to share their story. They nodded and moved to the small kitchen area, putting together a simple meal of bread, dried fish, and tea. She ate with careful deliberation, as if each bite was a gift she didn't want to waste. I have nowhere to go, she said suddenly, looking up from her bowl. No family in your land, no coin for passage elsewhere. Her fingers tightened around. The spoon I can work. I know how to tend fires, prepare food, mend clothing. I can clean and organize. She paused, then added more quietly. I can read the sky and water, predict weather changes days before they come. That caught his attention. You're a weather worker, something like that? She stood and moved to the window, studying the horizon with professional interest. The wind will shift by midday, coming from the southwest. Rain again by evening, but gentle. The big storms are finished for now. Kieran frowned. His own instruments suggested fair weather for at least 2 days. But something in her certainty made him take notice. And in exchange for this work, a place to sleep. Food when you can spare it. She turned back to him, and for a moment her composure cracked, showing the desperation underneath. I won't be trouble. You'll barely know I'm here. This isn't a boarding house, Naya. I keep the lighthouse because I prefer being alone. I understand. That. Her voice was steady again. But you didn't leave me to drown, so perhaps you're not as fond of solitude as you believe. She had a point, though he wasn't ready to admit it. Kieran studied her face, noting the way she held herself straight-backed. Despite exhaustion, proud despite having nothing, whatever had driven her into that storm, it hadn't broken her spirit. 1 week, he said finally. We'll see how it goes. Relief flickered across her features, quickly hidden. Thank you. She kept her word from the first day, while Kieran tended. The lighthouse mechanisms, she cleaned and organized his living space with an efficiency that spoke of practice. She prepared meals that were simple, but better seasoned than anything he'd made for himself. Most importantly, she stayed out of his way, seeming to sense when he needed silence and when a few quiet words might be welcome. But it was her weather predictions that truly impressed him. She was right about the afternoon wind shift, right? About the evening rain. The next day she warned him of a fog bank that would roll in before dawn, dense enough to require constant vigilance at the beacon. He spent the night adjusting the light's intensity and sounding the foghorn at regular intervals. And by morning 3 ships had safely navigated past the treacherous rocks. How do you do it? He asked over breakfast, genuinely curious. Naya glanced up from kneading dough for the day's bread. I watch. I listen. The sea speaks to those who know her language. And where did you learn this language? The walls went up again, swift and impenetrable, from people who are no longer part of my life. That evening, as they sat by the fire after another accurate weather prediction had proved its worth, Kieran found himself hoping the week would pass slowly, the first time in years. The lighthouse didn't feel like a prison of his own choosing, but he could see in Naya's eyes that she was still looking over her shoulder, still expecting something. To come for her across the water, whatever she was running from, it wasn't finished with her yet. 2 weeks had passed since the storm brought Naya to Beacon's Point, and Kieran had stopped mentioning her departure. She had proven herself invaluable, not just for her weather sense. but for the way she'd quietly improved every aspect of his isolated existence. The lighthouse had never been so organized, his meals never so satisfying, and his weather logs never so accurate. He was beginning to think she might stay permanently when the merchant, a ship, appeared on the horizon. Kieran was adjusting the great lens when he spotted the vessel, a sleek three-masted ship with dark sails that moved with predatory grace through the calm waters. Something about it made him uneasy, though he couldn't say why. Ships passed Beacon's Point regularly, but this one seemed to be heading directly for the lighthouse's small harbor. "Naya," he called down the stairs, "we have visitors coming." He heard her footsteps stop abruptly. When she appeared at the top of the stairs, her face had gone pale. She moved to the window and watched the approaching ship with the intensity of a hunted animal. "Do you know them?" Kieran asked. "Maybe." Her voice was tight. "I need to stay out of sight." Before he could ask more questions, she had disappeared back down the stairs. Kieran heard the sound of the storage closet door closing, a space barely large enough for one person to hide. Whatever was aboard that ship terrified her more than the storm that had nearly killed her. The ship anchored in the small bay, and a longboat was lowered into the water. Kieran watched 3 figures row toward shore to sailors, and a man in a long coat who carried himself with obvious authority. As they approached, Kieran could make out more details. The leader was perhaps 40, with prematurely gray hair and a neat beard, well-dressed, but with the weathered hands of someone who'd spent real time at sea. Kieran met them at the dock, projecting the casual friendliness expected of a lighthouse keeper. "Welcome to Beacon's Point. I'm Kieran Thorne. What brings you to our little corner of nowhere?" The gray-haired man stepped forward with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Captain Dorian Blackwater of the Serpent's Wake. We're bound for Saltmere, but I hoped you might help us with a small matter." His accent was refined, educated, but underneath it, Kieran detected something harder. "I'll help if I can. We're looking for someone, a young woman who may have washed up along this coast. Dark hair, olive skin, quite distinctive tattoos on her arms." Blackwater's tone remained pleasant, but his gaze was sharp as it swept over Kieran's face, watching for any reaction. "She went missing during a storm several weeks ago. Her family is quite worried." Kieran kept his expression neutral. "Storms claim a lot of people out here. Haven't seen anyone matching that description, but I could keep an eye out." "That's very kind." Blackwater stepped closer. Kieran caught a whiff of expensive tobacco and something else, a metallic scent that made him think of blood. "The thing is, she's not just any missing person. She's quite valuable to certain ... interests. There would be a substantial reward for information about her whereabouts." "What kind of interests?" Blackwater's smile widened slightly. "Let's just say she possesses certain skills that are highly sought after, skills related to navigation and weather prediction. Very rare abilities passed down through specific bloodlines." He paused, studying Kieran's reaction. "Skills that could make a lighthouse keeper's job much easier, I'd imagine." The implication was clear. Blackwater knew, or strongly suspected, that Naya was here. Kieran felt a chill that had nothing to do with the sea breeze. "Sounds like someone worth finding. I'll definitely keep my eyes open." "I'm sure you will." Blackwater reached into his coat and produced a small leather pouch that clinked with the sound of coins, a token of good faith. There's much more where that came from if you prove helpful. Kieran made no move to take the pouch. "That's generous, but I haven't done anything to earn it yet. Of course." Blackwater's eyes hardened slightly, the pleasant facade slipping for just a moment. "Well, we'll be in Saltmere for the next few days taking on supplies. If you remember anything at all, we'd be most grateful to hear from you." The 3 men returned to their boat, but Kieran noticed that one of the sailors kept glancing back at the lighthouse as they rowed away. The Serpent's Wake didn't leave immediately. Instead, it remained anchored in the bay, a dark silhouette against the afternoon sky. Kieran waited until he was sure they were out of earshot before calling softly, "They're gone." Naya emerged from the storage closet, her face ashen. She moved to the window and stared out at the ship with undisguised fear. "Who is he?" Kieran asked. "Captain Blackwater trades in people," she said quietly. "Specifically, People like me. People with ... unusual abilities. She wrapped her arms around herself. He works for those who cast me out. Your family, my tribe, my people. Her voice was bitter. They didn't want me anymore, but they also don't want anyone else to have what I can do. Kieran studied her profile as she watched the ship. What did you do to make them cast you out? For a long moment she was silent, and so quietly he almost missed it. She said, I showed mercy to those who didn't deserve it. The weight of those words hung between them as the sun began to set, and the serpent's wake remained anchored in their bay like a patient predator. The ship stayed for 3 days, never approaching shore again, but never leaving either. Kieran went about his duties with forced normalcy while Naya remained hidden inside. Moving away from windows whenever she heard voices carried on the wind, the tension was wearing on both of them. But it was the arrival of the second ship that shattered their fragile peace. This vessel was different, smaller but more ornate, with sails dyed deep blue and hull painted with intricate silver patterns. That seemed to shift in the changing light. It appeared at dawn on the 4th day, gliding into the bay with an otherworldly grace that made Kieran's skin crawl. They found me, Naya whispered from behind the curtain where she watched. Her voice carried a resignation that was somehow worse than fear. Who are they? The Tide Speakers. My people. She let the curtain fall and turned away from the window. This is where we part ways, Kieran. I won't bring their wrath down on you. Wait. He caught her arm as she moved toward the door. Tell me what this is really about. All of it. She looked down at his hand on her arm, then up at his face. For the first time since he'd pulled her from the waves, she seemed to be weighing whether to trust him completely. My tribe serves the ocean itself, she said finally. We read its moods, predict its storms, guide its currents, but we also enforce its laws. When coastal villages take too much from the sea, when merchants dump their poisons into sacred waters, we ... respond. You're warriors. I was. Her amber eyes were distant, remembering. 3 months ago, we were sent to deal with a fishing village that had been using forbidden nets, the kind that take everything, leaving nothing for the sea to regenerate. The elders ordered us to sink their boats and drive them inland. Kieran waited, sensing there was more. But when we got there... She paused, her hands clenching into fists. They had children working on those boats. Little ones, barely old enough to walk, helping their families survive. The other Tide Speakers said it didn't matter. The sea's laws came first. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I couldn't do it. I warned the village instead, helped them hide. Their children when the others came, and for that they cast you out. For that they marked me as traitor. She pushed up her sleeves, showing him the blue tattoos he'd noticed that first night. In the morning light, he could see that some of the intricate patterns had been deliberately scarred over, marred by what looked like ritual cuts. These marks bind us to our tribe, to our power over wind and wave. The scarring was supposed to sever that connection, leave me powerless. But it didn't work completely, Kieran guessed. That's how you can still predict the weather. The sea remembers its children, even those who've been disowned. A bitter smile crossed her face. That's why they want me back, a Tide Speaker. Who can't be controlled is a threat they can't ignore. A horn sounded from the bay, deep and resonant, like the call of some great sea creature. Naya's face went white. Elda Morgan, she breathed. She's come herself. Through the lighthouse window, Kieran could see figures disembarking from the ornate ship. There were 6 of them, moving with fluid grace across the water as if they weren't quite bound by the same laws of physics as everyone else. At their head was a tall woman with silver-streaked hair that seemed to flow like water itself. She's my grandmother, Naya said quietly, the one who ordered my punishment. The group approached the lighthouse with unhurried confidence, spreading out as they climbed the rocky path in a formation that spoke of military training. Elder Morgan knocked on the door with 3 measured strikes that seemed to echo longer than they should. Kieran looked at Naya one more time. You could run out the back, up the cliff path. Where would I go that they couldn't find me? She squared her shoulders. No, this has to end. Kieran opened the door to find Elder Morrigan studying him with eyes the same amber color as Naya's, but colder. Up close, her presence was almost overwhelming, like standing too close to a massive wave just before it broke. "Lighthouse keeper," she said, her voice carrying the sound of distant tides. "You have something that belongs to us." "Have a guest who asked for shelter," Kieran replied carefully. "Nothing more." Morrigan stepped past him without invitation, her companions following. The lighthouse suddenly felt much smaller. "Naya," she called, not looking around, but somehow knowing exactly where her granddaughter was. "Come out, child. It's time to return home." Naya emerged from behind the curtain, walking with careful dignity, despite the fear in her eyes. "Grandmother, you look well. Better than you deserve, considering your crimes." Morrigan's gaze took in the clean, organized space, the signs of comfortable domesticity. "This human has cared for you. How touching." "Leave him out of this," Naya said quickly. "This is between us. Everything is between us, child. You are bound to the tribe by blood and oath, no matter how far you run." Morrigan turned her attention back to Kieran. "As for you, lighthouse keeper, you have harbored a criminal, but the tide speakers are not unreasonable. Step aside now, and we will trouble you no further." Kieran looked at Naya, saw the resignation in her face, the way she'd already accepted defeat. Then he looked at Elder Morrigan and her silent, threatening companions. "No," he said quietly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The word hung in the air like a challenge thrown down before an ancient god. Elder Morrigan's amber eyes widened slightly, as if she couldn't quite believe what she'd heard. Behind her, the other tide speakers shifted restlessly. Hands moving to weapons, Kieran couldn't see, but could definitely feel. "I beg your pardon?" Morgan's voice carried the whisper of wind before a hurricane. "I said no." Kieran stepped slightly in front of Naya, not quite blocking her, but making his position clear. "She asked for sanctuary, and I gave it." "That doesn't." "And just because you sailed up to my door?" Naya grabbed his arm. "Kieran, don't. You don't understand what they can do." "I understand that they threw you out for saving children's lives," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I understand that they scarred your skin to try to break your connection to your own gifts. And I understand that now they want you back because they're afraid of what you might become without their control." One of the younger tide speakers snarled and took a step forward, but Morrigan raised her hand to stop him. "Careful, human. Speak of things beyond your comprehension."
"Do I?"
Kieran met her gaze steadily.
"Because from where I stand it
"Looks like you're terrified of a young woman who chose compassion over blind obedience. What kind of power does that threaten?" "She broke the oldest laws." Morgan's composure cracked for the first time. "The sea does not forgive. The sea does not show mercy. It takes what it will and gives what it chooses, and we are its instruments of balance. When she warned those fishermen, she allowed them to continue their destruction of sacred waters. And the children working those boats," Kieran pressed. "What law demanded their deaths?" "Collateral damage," one of the other tide speakers said coldly. "The sea's justice doesn't distinguish between the guilty and the innocent, but Naya does." Kieran looked back at her, seeing something new in her amber eyes. Not resignation anymore, but a growing spark of defiance. "That's what you're really afraid of, isn't it? That she might teach others to think for themselves instead of following orders blindly?" Morrigan's face hardened. "Enough philosophy? Naya, you will return with us now. Your exile has gone on long enough, and your education requires completion." "What education?" Naya asked, though Kieran could hear the dread in her voice. "The bonding ritual was interrupted by your flight," Morrigan said with cold satisfaction. "Captain Blackwater has agreed to complete it. You will serve the tribe by serving him, using your gifts to guide his ships and increase his profits. A fitting punishment for one who values human concerns over sacred duty." "You're selling her," Kieran said, the pieces falling into place. "That's what this is really about. You want to profit from her abilities while calling it justice?" "We want to ensure she can never again betray her people," Morgan snapped. "The bonding will tie her power to Blackwater's will. She will have no choice but to serve." The lighthouse shook suddenly, though there was no wind. Water began seeping under the door, forming puddles that shouldn't exist this high above the tide line. The other tide speakers were calling on their power, ready to wash away any resistance. But Naya stepped forward, and when she spoke, her voice carried an authority that made everyone pause. "The sea remembers its children," she said, echoing her earlier words to Kieran. "Even those you've tried to break." She raised her arms, and Kieran gasped as he saw the scarred tattoos on her skin begin to glow with soft blue light. The water that had been seeping in reverse direction, flowing back out under the door. The lighthouse stopped shaking. "Impossible," Morrigan whispered. "You taught me that the sea chooses its own servants," Naya said, her voice growing stronger. "But you forgot that the sea also chooses its own justice. Those children I saved, their gratitude, their parents' prayers of thanks. The sea heard. All of it. And it remembered." The glow around her tattoos intensified. Outside, Kieran could hear the waves responding to her call, growing rougher despite the calm weather. "I choose compassion," Naya declared. "I choose mercy. And I choose to stay here, with someone who values both." She looked at Kieran, and he saw not desperation now, but hope. "If you'll have me." "Always," he said without hesitation. Morgan raised her own hands, power crackling around her fingers like controlled lightning. "You cannot defy us forever, child. We are your blood." Your heritage, her words, were cut off by a sound like thunder, but deeper and more resonant. Through the lighthouse windows, they could all see Captain Blackwater's ship, listing heavily to port, taking on water faster than his crew could pump it out. The Serpent's wake was sinking. "The sea chooses its own justice," Naya repeated quietly. Elder Morgan stared at her granddaughter for a long moment, seeing something there that hadn't been present before, not just defiance, but a power that had grown beyond the tribe's ability to contain or control. Finally, she nodded once, a gesture that might have been acknowledgement or farewell. "Perhaps it does," she said. "But remember this, Naya. The tide always returns. Always." The tide speakers filed out as quietly as they had entered, returning to their ornate ship. Within an hour, both vessels had departed, leaving Beacon's Point in peace once more. That evening, as Kieran tended the lighthouse beam and Naya prepared their simple dinner, he found himself watching her move about their shared space with a contentment he'd never expected to feel. The scars on her tattoos had faded but not disappeared, and he realized they no longer looked like marks of punishment. Instead, they looked like proof of choices made and prices willingly paid. "Any regrets?" he asked as they sat down to eat. Naya considered this seriously, gazing out at the ocean that stretched endlessly beyond their window. "The sea remembers everything," she said finally. "But it also forgives those who learn to listen to their own conscience instead of just its voice." She smiled at him, and for the first time since that storm-tossed night, it reached her eyes completely. No regrets. Outside, the lighthouse beam swept across calm waters, guiding travelers safely home through the darkness. And inside, too, people who had found refuge in each other settled into the quiet rhythm of a life chosen rather than imposed. While the sea sang its ancient songs of change and redemption beyond their door,